Genesis 48, please turn there. We're going to look at Jacob blessing his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and I'll read the whole chapter, Genesis 48. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers and their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his fathers, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, and so he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and he brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who's redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, father, since this one is my firstborn, put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall be a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." What was the greatest moment of faith of Jacob's life? Was it Bethel, when he had a vision of the angels ascending on a stairway to heaven, the ladder of heaven? Was it when he wrestled with the angel of God and said to him, or God, and said to him, "I won't let go until you bless me"? Was it when he left Canaan and when he went into the unknown of Egypt? Well, when describing Jacob's greatest moment of faith, the author of Hebrews, he focused on what Jacob did when he was dying. The blessing of Joseph's sons displayed the greatest amount of Jacob's faith. Hebrews 11, the author of Hebrews, wrote these words about the faith of Jacob on his dying bed. He said, "By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff." Jacob reached his greatest moment of faith at the very end of his life. And you and I can too. Our best days can still be ahead of us, and our faith can even grow stronger as we age. One pastor said, "We can rise to greater heights by God's grace." What did Jacob do in these final days on his deathbed that would have a lasting impact for generations to come? Well, he passed on a spiritual heritage and also a spiritual blessing to his children and to his grandchildren. The first thing we see here is that Jacob, he passed down a spiritual heritage to his son and to his grandsons. What we learn here in the beginning of Genesis 48 is that Jacob was very ill. And this is the first time we hear the word or see the word ill in the Bible. He was extremely ill enough to where he was bedridden. He was gonna die on his bed right there. And when Joseph got the word about this, he ended up gathering his two oldest sons, and they went to see his father and their grandfather. And while he was there, it was interesting because Joseph got there, and Jacob immediately started talking to him. And Jacob told Joseph, his son, he reminded him of the blessings of God. He reminded them of the promise that God gave to him, just as he gave to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. And that was that God would bless Jacob and his future line, where there would be many nations. They would have many people coming from them, and they would also receive land one day. And so this was the first thing that Jacob said to Joseph. He reminded them of God's promise. But then what's really fascinating is what happened next after he reminded Joseph of the promise that God had given him and his father and his grandfather. He ends up adopting Joseph's two oldest sons. He formally adopts them. Verse 5, he said, "And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine as Reuben and Simeon are, and the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers and their inheritance." Now stop for a moment and think about this. Jacob, who is older, he's formally adopting his grandsons on his deathbed. What? Could you imagine, for those of you who have children, that your parents just said to you, "Hey, I'm gonna adopt your kids. They're mine." Well, that just happened. Joseph, I don't think was expecting this, but he gets there and his father said, "Hey, I'm going to adopt your two sons. They're gonna be formally mine." Now, why did he do this? Well, he did this because this showed that his last affection towards Joseph. Jacob loved Joseph, and he had a deep affection for Joseph. And he wanted to show the greatest amount of love to his son, and that was an act where he adopted his sons as his own. He claimed his sons as his own, and what he was doing was he was saying, "I'm gonna give your sons the double portion, the special privileges that Reuben and Simeon should have had." Reuben and Simeon were the oldest of Jacob's sons, the 12 sons, and Reuben and Simeon, they messed up. We know that Reuben, he ended up sleeping with his father's concubine. That was a no-no. We know that Simeon did some wrongful deeds, and the other sons were pretty mischievous as well. And so as Jacob is looking at Joseph, he's saying to Joseph, just as Simeon and Reuben were going to be the firstborn and receive the firstborn rights, so now your sons are gonna receive that double portion. They're going to receive my inheritance. They're going to receive that special privilege and those special rights. So as you look at Old Testament history, you'll find, even next week, you'll hear about the blessings of all the sons that Jacob gives and then he passes. You'll find that there are 12 tribes of Israel. And we know that 10 of those sons each received one tribe. But yet Joseph received two, the double portion. He received two tribes through his own sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And as you read through the Old Testament, you'll see that Manasseh had his own tribe and Ephraim had his own tribe. This was all a part of Jacob blessing Joseph because he specifically loved Joseph. And he also really loved Joseph's mom, Rachel. And we see that in verse 7 as he mentions her. So this was a way that he honored his deceased wife in a way that he would honor his son. He would pass this spiritual legacy of faith to Joseph's sons by adopting them. And when he adopted them, he was basically saying, boys, you are not Egyptian. Even though your father is the prince of Egypt, even though your mother is a princess of Egypt, even though you have learned the Egyptian language, even though you're in this Egyptian culture, what Jacob was saying, you don't belong in Egypt, boys, grandsons. You belong with me. You belong with the people of God, the covenant people of God. You belong in the land of Canaan. And so that's why I'm formally adopting you as my own. This was a major statement that Jacob was making, not only to Joseph, but to his two grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And what I love about what Jacob did here is he passed this spiritual legacy down, the spiritual legacy of faith down to his grandsons. And I want you to notice a couple things here. He did it both formally, without words, and then he spoke with words of blessing and of remembrance. What Jacob did here was a moment that his son Joseph and his grandsons would never, ever forget. He wanted this memory to be etched away in their mind and in their hearts. He wanted them to hold on to this memory for the rest of their lives and even talk about this memory in this moment throughout so the generations would hear about it. Jacob was very intentional about what he was doing here. And this is why the author of Hebrews mentioned he had an incredible amount of faith. I want you to notice a couple things that he did. He was very formal in the way he adopted these grandkids. The first thing he did was he actually, when Joseph came in, what did Joseph do? Joseph brought the boys to him, and Jacob, this older grandfather, he kisses the grandsons. Did you notice that on the head? And he hugs them. And then after he lets them go, then what does Joseph do? He bows down to his dying father. Now, I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to think about this sacred moment here. Here's a father who's 57 years old at this time, and he's on his knees bowing down to his father. Do you think the grandsons would remember that? Hey, I'll just tell you, if my dad, if he bowed down to my grandfather in front of me, and I'm like 20 years old, you better believe I'd remember that moment. I mean, this doesn't happen every day. But Joseph gets on his hands and knees, and he's showing reverence, a deep-seated reverence to his father who's dying. This was part of the tradition of Israel. So not only did the grandfather, part of the tradition was a kiss on the forehead of the grandsons and a hug and embrace, but also a father who's bowing down, showing reverence to his father. That's part of the customs and courtesies. That's part of the tradition of the Israelites as they begin to pass down a legacy of faith. And then right after that, Joseph gets up and he gathers these two sons and he takes them to his father and he places them to where the father could put his hands on the heads of these two children. And the first head was where the right hand was supposed to be placed on the eldest son, and the left hand was supposed to be placed on the younger son. Why is that? The right hand shows authority. It's saying, I'm going to bless you. You're going to receive double portion. So the oldest was supposed to receive the right hand on his head, and the youngest was supposed to receive the left hand. What did Jacob do? He switched it. But everything he was doing was on purpose, and it was intentional. And he was doing these things, these acts, so that it would etch away in their minds, and they would remember this moment, this sacred moment. Now, before I go on to talk about why he did this, I want to just tell you, as part of being a pastor, it's a privilege to be a part of big ceremonies. And even as a military chaplain, I'm a part of formal ceremonies all the time. So whenever I do military stuff, I pray I do the invocation for promotions and for retirement ceremonies and all these other formal military ceremonies. And every time I do these things, there's customs and courtesies. You have to stand at attention at specific times. People do vows and the oath of office when they swear in another 4 years or 6-year term. You have gifts that are given. You have coins that are given. You have all these different customs and courtesies and all the standard protocols of having to stand at a certain time and having to sit and everything is just laid out to a T. Why is it that way? It's because the military wants to pass down a certain heritage. They want to keep that certain heritage going, that tradition of honor and legacy of valor. They want to keep that going. So as we do these ceremonies, it's really important for everybody to be in lockstep agreement and to see how it's done so that they can pass it down to the next generation. The same goes for the church. You know, yesterday we had a funeral here. There's certain things that we do at funerals. There's certain things we say, but certain things we do. Like, for example, when you have a person that shares words of remembrance, that takes place. We have people stand up as the family comes in and sit down when we start the service. What do we do at graveside? The head of the tomb is always facing east, and so I always have to stand where the head of the tomb is. You know, there's all these fascinating things, even when it comes to funerals. What about weddings? Whenever you're a part of a wedding, what are the sacred ritual things that we do? We have vows. You know, husband and wife, they hold hands and they say vows back and forth. What about the exchange of rings? That's a sacred thing that we do, right? It's a symbol of a couple being united together as one. What do I say at the end? I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Now you can kiss the bride, and the kiss is part of the ceremony. That's tradition. You think about all these different things that we do as people here in the States, and even as believers. Everything has a purpose to it. Everything has a meaning to it. And that's what Jacob was doing with his son and grandsons. He was being very methodical, very intentional, so that it would stay in their minds. And they would remember this incredible moment as he was passing down this spiritual legacy of faith. So what about you? Is there anything, when you think about your family, is there anything that you can do to pass down your faith to future generations to come? Is there an emblem you can give, or a memorabilia, or something that you can pass down that maybe a Bible that can go on for centuries? It may be your wedding dress that your daughter will wear and then their daughter will wear. You know what I'm saying? Like, all families have certain kind of memorabilia that you hold on to and you can pass down. So I would encourage you this week to think about what that could be for your family. Maybe you already have something, but if you don't, start something. Start something and pass down that generational faith for generations to come, and pass down that spiritual legacy. The thing I want to mention about the crossing of the hands, it's fascinating. So as Joseph or Jacob did this, he's supposed to place his right hand on the oldest and his left hand on the younger one. But what did he do? Whoop, he did this. And how did Joseph respond to that? What did Joseph say? He's like, he's disturbed. And he said to his father, not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. He's like, no, stop, Dad. You're getting this mixed up. But you know what I think is really fascinating here is that Jacob's hands are very symbolic. They're very symbolic. And Jacob's hands, without Jacob saying a word, him doing this, it tells the story of his life. This week I listened to Sinclair Ferguson and his sermon on this, and he mentioned this. I never thought about this. But he said Jacob's hands, without saying a word, it told the story of his faith and just his life. You think about Jacob's hands, how they were the hands that stirred the stew, which deceived his brother from his inheritance. Those were the hands that he carefully covered animal skin as he went in to deceive his own father when he acted like his brother Esau to receive his father's blessing. These were the hands that lifted the veil at his wedding, thinking he was marrying Rachel, but he realized it was Leah. These were the hands that wrestled with God, or with the angel of God. These were the hands that put together the coat of many colors and put this coat on his favorite son, Joseph. These were the hands that held the bloodied robe when he thought Joseph had died. These were the hands that held his newborn son, Benjamin, and he was weeping and mourning because his loved wife, Rachel, died when his son, Benjamin, was born. These were the hands that embraced Joseph after 25 years of thinking that his son was dead. And these were the hands that were placed on the heads of his grandsons. Jacob's hands told the story of his life. These hands, Jacob's hands, made a lot of mistakes. He used it for deceit. He also used it for good. And now in his final moments, he's using his hands once again, and he crisscrosses it. He changes things up. And Joseph is probably thinking, oh no, not again. Jacob, my father, is using his hands for deceit, and here we go again. But what did Jacob say to his son? He said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he shall also be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Jacob's hands crossed, symbolizing that the younger would be greater than the older. You see, Jacob learned throughout his life to rely on the grace of God. He learned over the years that God does not have to act in line with the conventional way of doing things. God is sovereignly free to accomplish his good will, even apart from our plans and presumptions. And we, my friends, we must embrace the way of the Lord even when it's unconventional. It's the grace of God, not the timing of one's birth, that is the conduit through which blessing comes. You see, God's grace is sovereign, and God's plans were for the younger to be greater than the older, to receive the blessings from the Father more than the older. That was God's plans. And sometimes we scratch our heads and we think, why did that happen? Why did God do that? Well, God has a reason for everything. His ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. And at this very moment, once again, God changes things up. Jacob wasn't being deceitful, he was being intentional. And this is what God had planned, that one day, the younger brother Ephraim would be greater than the other brothers. In fact, the 10 tribes of Israel would later be called the tribe of Ephraim. The tribe of Ephraim. Because of this moment. I bring all this up because, again, Jacob was very intentional about passing down this spiritual heritage. And he knew that this was part of God's plan. It was also pretty common now in Genesis for the younger to receive the blessing more than the older. Jacob over Esau. We know about Abel over Cain. Cain was older, but Abel was more blessed. And then we know Seth came in line. He was the third son of Adam and Eve. He was blessed. And now yet again, we see the younger son, Ephraim, being blessed before Manasseh. God does things that make us scratch our head sometimes. Again, his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And Jacob was just going about his business, putting together enforcing the will of God through this. So right here we see that Jacob didn't say a word. He used his hands that told a story. All of our hands, by the way, tell a story. You think about all those things you did that you shouldn't have done with your hand. You think about all the things that you did that were great, that received blessings. Think about when you held your wife at the altar, you were holding hands. That's pretty neat. You think about the ring that was placed on your hand. You think about when you held a baby for the first time, your hands. What else with your hands? You think about when you shook the hand, when you got that job, or when you got that house that you wanted, you shook the hand in agreement. Your hands tell a story. So another thing I want you to think about is think about your hand and think about how that traces your story. Jacob's hands told a story. He didn't have to say a word, but yet the boys would remember this for the rest of their lives. The second thing I want you to notice is not only did Jacob pass the spiritual heritage by not saying a word, by just doing these rituals and customs and courtesies, but he also said some things that were very impactful. Verse 15, he blessed Joseph and he said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Right here, Jacob speaks, and he's saying words that his son and his grandsons would remember. And what does he say? What does he say? He reminded them that God was before his father and his grandfather, just as he's going to be before them. He reminded them that God was his shepherd and cared for him and protected them, and even angels protected him. He even said that his name would be carried along with them, along with his father and grandfather in the years and generations to come as a multitude of people would gather. Do you know what Jacob was doing here? He was telling his grandchildren what God had done for him. He was telling them about how God was faithful. When is the last time, for those of you who are parents or grandparents, when is the last time you talked about God's faithfulness to your kids and grandkids? When was the last time? It may have been a while. I would encourage you to think about what you can say to your kids and grandkids. How can you pass your spiritual heritage of faith to them by your words? You know, about 6 months ago, we had the privilege of having my mom move next door. For a year and a half, she had prayed every single day that this house would become available. It was our neighbor, and she rents it out. It's this small single-family home, and it's literally in our backyard. Couldn't have been better. So she prayed for a year and a half every single day, and God answered her prayers. So 6 months ago, she moves in, and thank you all for coming. Some of you came and built a ramp for her. It was really, really nice. And it's been so great having my mom literally next door. And one of the things that I would say has been the most beneficial of having mom next to us is she's around her grandkids. And so every day, one of our kids will go with Nana on a walk, and they will walk her dog with her. And they go for about 45 minutes or an hour every day. And after school, they go and they walk with Cody the dog, and they're walking the dog as Nana's next to him, and Nana gives them $5. Now, the $5 is nice, but you know what's even better? Is as they're walking, Nana is literally reading stories of God's faithfulness to her throughout her life. She's telling my kids stories after stories of how God showed up in her life and in our lives. That's invaluable. And my kids are gonna be so much better off because of it. They're gonna remember these moments that they had with Nana, and they're gonna be able to tell their kids some of those stories that Nana shared with them. And then those stories will continue on and on and on. Thank you, Mom, for doing that. What about you? How intentional are you? It might be as easy as that. You're just going on a walk. The other thing I've been told is when you have kids in the car, that's when you have a captive audience. Especially as they get older, tell them to turn off the screens and talk about God's beauty and God's glory. Talk about God's faithfulness. You got them right there. You have a captive audience in the car. Use the car talks to your advantage, parents and grandparents. That's how we can pass down this spiritual heritage of faith. And that's exactly what Jacob was doing here. He was very, very intentional. He was brief. He didn't go on and on and on. He was brief and to the point, but he said words with wisdom. He was very poignant. And he said, okay, I want you to remember these words. And I guarantee it etched away in their minds and hearts for generations to come. Not only did Jacob pass down this spiritual heritage, but he ended up passing a spiritual blessing. He first blessed Joseph, but then this short verse in verse 20, he ends up putting his hands on the boys' heads and he blesses them. And this is all he said. He said, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. For just a few brief moments, these grandsons heard the wisdom of their dying grandfather. And they would never, ever, ever forget it. They would never, ever forget it. Not just the moment where he crossed his hands, not just the moment where he kissed their forehead and hugged them, not just the moment where their father bowed down to the ground. They would remember the words that he spoke to them, the blessings that he gave them. What words can you say to your kids and your grandkids that will last for generations to come? Is there a blessing that you can give them? Last summer, I mentioned this before, but I had the privilege of taking my two oldest daughters camping in outside of Denver, Colorado. And it was a father-daughter retreat of dads and 10 to 12-year-old girls. And I'll never forget that moment with these girls. We went kayaking, and we caught crawdads, and they painted my face, and we came up with a chant, and guys, don't hold this against me, but they painted my nails, It was just a moment where I got to be with my girls, and we've never had that kind of moment. And it was a moment I'll never forget. I don't know about you, but I'll never forget it. But at the very end, they told me, and they told all the dads, they said, we want you at the very end to speak a blessing to your daughters. We want you to come up with something that's special and speak it over them. And so for hours, in the middle of the night or in the early morning, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I want to make this memorable. And, they probably won't remember everything I'm going to say, but what can I say? And I thought, this is the moment that I want to tell Abby and Katie why Stephanie and me named them Abby and Katie. I don't know about you, but names are important to us. And I remember Stephanie and I, we spent hours just wrestling with what are we gonna name our kids? And we were looking at meanings and how they would flow and with our last name and how it would sound. And I thought, I wanna tell all my kids why we name them their names when they reach a certain point. And I was like, this is the time. And so I get on my knees and they're on this camping chair and I'm reading this blessing to them and I'm literally telling them why we named them Abby and Katie. And you know what? I was bawling like a baby. And I don't cry that much. I think it's good to cry, okay? It's good to cry. David cried, I cry sometimes. But I don't cry that much. And I was bawling. There's something about a dad and their daughters, There's just something about a dad and their daughters. But I'm just bawling like a baby. I'll never, ever forget that moment. And I don't think they will either, right? Would you ever consider doing something like that? Would you ever consider writing out a spiritual blessing to your children and grandchildren? And would you ever consider giving that to them and speaking life to them? It'll be a moment they'll never, ever, ever, ever forget. Jacob wanted to pass the spiritual heritage, and he wanted to pass the spiritual blessing on to his son and grandsons so that generations would talk about it. And guess what? We're talking about it today. These things are sacred, they're inspiring, they're important. And so as you develop your own traditions for your families, please keep this sermon in mind in the years to come.